Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So today we're going to finally start getting into cellular respiration itself. So when we look at the overall chemical reaction for cellular respiration as a whole process, we're going to feed in a molecule of glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen, and that's ultimately going to return 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, and a bunch of ATP as products. You are going to need to know that chemical reaction, so start memorizing it now. The other thing that I'm going to encourage you to start paying attention to, because you'll need to know this as well, is where those reactants get used in the process and where those products come out as waste. Um, so when we start getting into cellular respiration, what you're seeing here is the overall process, right? But remember we talked last time about the fact that metabolism as a whole is really a huge pathway. It's a series of chemical reactions. Um, what we're doing is taking the hundreds of chemical reactions in cellular respiration and boiling it down to a single chemical reaction. There's a lot of stuff going on here in the middle that we're going to start talking about. And so I'm going to ask that as we start getting into the details here, that you understand where the glucose is going in, where the oxygen is being utilized, and where these products are being produced. So just kind of keep that in the back of your head. So overarchingly, we're going to see that cellular respiration is an aerobic process, meaning that it requires oxygen. So once again, go back to that evolution idea, right? Cellular respiration wasn't going to be one of the very first metabolic processes to evolve on Earth because there was very little to no oxygen in existence. Cellular respiration didn't come around until after photosynthesis evolved, until after all of those autotrophs were producing this insane amounts of oxygen that bubbled out of the oceans up into the atmosphere and eventually allowed that oxygen to become a major component to our atmosphere. But the cool thing is that we're going to see that because that oxygen eventually evolved, because photosynthesis evolved and set the stage for cellular respiration to evolve, being an aerobic process is going to allow us to create insane amounts of energy from a single molecule of glucose, as opposed to the type of heterotrophic metabolism that would have existed pre-photosynthesis. So we're going to talk about cellular respiration here, right? An aerobic process that produces tons of energy. Before we move on to photosynthesis, though, we'll talk about anaerobic respiration, or respiration that occurs without oxygen, something you may have heard as fermentation. And fermentation isn't going to be able to create insane amounts of energy, but it can create some without oxygen present. So, in terms of evolution, things like chemosynthesis and fermentation would have been early evolutionary chemical metabolism processes. Photosynthesis then shows up, which then allows cellular respiration to evolve and increase the amount of efficiency that we can use as cells to break that glucose down in terms of the amount of energy that I get. So cellular respiration is incredibly efficient compared to the fermentation that would have existed pre-cellular respiration's evolution. So where does cellular respiration happen in our cells? They happen in our mitochondria. So our mitochondria are going to be the place that the bulk of cellular respiration occurs. And so having that organelle present in our eukaryotic cells, right, is a big deal. We're going to talk about the mitochondrial structure a little bit today as well. Also going to be something that's important for you to know. So not only should you be able to memorize this chemical reaction, be able to understand where the reactants go in, where the products come out in terms of the process of cellular respiration as we get into some more details. But you should also understand where those cellular respiration parts, we're going to break the major pathways down into component parts, where those parts take place within the mitochondria itself. So let's talk about the fact that this is cellular respiration, right? Where's that word that you've probably come across perhaps before? And you may have heard respiration in terms of breathing, right? So when we look at multicellular organisms like ourselves, there is a connection there. Um, Cellular respiration is not the same thing as breathing, but it's gas exchange. We need those gases in order to make this work. So remember that cellular respiration is an aerobic process. It requires oxygen to come in. We also end up producing carbon dioxide as a byproduct of cellular respiration. Your body can't use that carbon dioxide, so it has to get rid of it. And so your lungs are really the initial connection point for allowing us to get that oxygen into your body. We then diffuse that oxygen from your lungs into your blood. Your blood then carries it on your red blood cells to your what we call capillary beds, which are really thin little blood vessels right up against your tissue cells, so that we can diffuse that oxygen to those tissues, right? Something like your muscle cells, so that your muscle cells can do that cellular respiration and then get rid of the carbon dioxide by diffusing that carbon dioxide into those red blood cells, taking it back to your lungs, diffusing it into your lung cells, and then you breathe it out. Okay, so if we zoom into those cells that are doing cellular respiration, then they have to have mitochondria. The more cellular respiration demands they have, the more energy demands that they have, the more mitochondria they're going to have inside their cells. So it's really going to be important to understand that mitochondrial structure in terms of where different parts of cellular respiration are taking place and why they take place there. So when we look at your mitochondria, right, they've got that smooth outer membrane. They have inner membrane space between that outer membrane and then their really highly inner folded inner membrane. And we're going to talk about those folds or those of that inner membrane. We're going to call them these cristae. And those inner folds are going to be really important because we're going to do active transport and passive transport across that membrane, just like we talked about in cell transport. The more surface area you have, the more efficient it is to move materials across a membrane. So these mitochondria have that highly interfolded inner membrane to increase surface area. And we're going to increase that surface area for something we'll talk later about as the ETC, which is just a shorthand way to write electron transport chain. Maybe you want to take note of that here so that you remember it later. So those cristae are going to be really important when we get to the final um, component piece to cellular respiration, and we talk about that electron transport chain. Inside the internals of that inner membrane is a jelly-like substance called your matrix. Remember, these guys are part of that endosymbiotic theory, right? Bigger prokaryote ate these smaller prokaryotes. Eventually, they had a symbiotic relationship, I should say, and that's how we got those eukaryotic cells. So that outer membrane is probably a result of an old food vacuole. Um, Inner membrane would have been the original membrane of that prokaryote that never got digested. Its matrix would be essentially its cytoplasm. And remember that they have their own free ribosomes. Okay, so they can do some of their own protein synthesis from their own mitochondrial DNA that also exists there. Okay, for our purposes in terms of cellular respiration, knowing that inner membrane space is going to become important, knowing your matrix is going to be important, and then knowing those cristae or those all of those folds in that inner membrane are also going to become very important. So we're going to break down cellular respiration into essentially three major steps, right? Remember, it's this huge metabolic pathway, so there's tons of chemical reactions that are happening within each of these processes. But in order to make it digestible and understandable for you guys who are learning this for the first time, we're going to break it down into these three major steps. And then we'll talk about a few subsets of steps in each of these as we go. So glycolysis is going to be the first one, and that's going to actually happen outside the mitochondria in your cytoplasm. And if you look at this term and you know some of your prefixes and suffixes that we've been learning this year, maybe you recognize some of this. And so glyco is actually sugar, and lyse means to break. So breaking sugars. This is going to be our very first step where we feed in that glucose and literally break it down and just start breaking it down. Next is going to come grooming, which is kind of going to be a half step, a connection point from glycolysis to this Krebs cycle, or you may come across it as the citric acid cycle. And that Krebs cycle is going to happen within the matrix of our mitochondria. So we're going to take the products of glycolysis, feed it into the matrix. That grooming process here in the middle is going to help us get it into the mitochondria and in the right forms to then feed it into this cycle. And it literally is going to be a cycle. So the products and reactants that we create and use are going to just constantly get cycled through that set of chemical reactions. I do throw here that there are two names for it. Krebs cycle. Krebs is the guy who discovered it, so that's a common name there. You may also come across it as the citric acid cycle. Citric acid is the first molecule that gets produced as that cycle turns as we go through those chemical reactions. So I just throw that in there in case you come across it. Typically, when you look at sort of lower high school level textbooks, they go with Krebs cycle. That's what we'll focus on most of the time. But you start looking at upper high school, college level textbooks, they'll use that term citric acid cycle. So I just give them to you both in case you ever come across one or the other that you know that they're the same thing. And then we have oxidative phosphorylation. So we're going to go to this final piece and talk about your electron transport chain, which is part of that, and chemoosmosis. And hopefully within these terms, you see some things you recognize. That phosphorylation, we talked about that in cell transport by adding phosphates to something. In this case, we're going to add those phosphates to ADP to make lots and lots of ATP. And maybe osmosis looks familiar. Water is going to become involved, and some transport is going to become involved. And that's where we're going to talk about all of the stuff that happens across that inner membrane of the mitochondria and why those inner folds, those cristae, are really important to increase the efficiency of all that transport that's going to come as part of that final step.